Hello and a good afternoon to everyone. My name is Victoria Williams. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs here at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thanks to everyone that is tuning in. I want to especially thank the Chicago Council members for joining us today on this important and timely conversation. Your support is critical to the work that we do here. If you are not yet a member but are interested in becoming part of the Council's globally engaged network, please visit our website at www.chicagocouncil.org/membership to learn more. Now, before we begin, a few brief housekeeping points to share. Please note that we are on the record and that we are recording. The Council is an independent and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals that we host are their own and do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Chicago Council. Towards the end of today's program, we'll be taking your questions. If you have a question for any of our panelists, we encourage you to simply enter ccga.live into your browser, follow the on-screen prompts, and you'll be able to submit or vote for your favorite question there. Finally, I'd like to extend our deepest gratitude to our program partner, the World Economic Forum, for collaborating with us to develop today's conversation. To share more about the great work the World Economic Forum network of Global Future Council is undertaking, I would like to welcome Paul Schmeich, head of the Regional Agenda in North America and member of the Executive Committee of the World Economic Forum, to share more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I was thinking this morning that if my calculations are right, we're entering the fourth decade of collaboration between the World Economic Forum and the Chicago Council on a range of issues. So it's really thrilling to be here today with this group. Yes, a quick word on the Global Future Councils. Of course, the World Economic Forum is known for the face-to-face meetings that we host. Obviously, those have been largely put on hold of late. But even pre-COVID, we were doing an awful lot that was online, digital, and much more year-round in nature than one-off events. And the Global Future Councils are groups. We have 50 different Global Future Councils on a range of subjects. And one of them, the one that we're focused on today, this year, or during the past year, just concluded its work, was focused on US foreign policy and specifically getting a group of gender balanced and also balanced ideologically of individual experts to sit around a table, virtual or real, and hash out over a 10-year time frame, how can Democrats and Republicans agree on a common path forward when it comes to principles of US foreign policy? And I emphasize this decade-long outlook. We tried very hard not to be, I would say, hijacked by headlines. We picked a very hard year not to be hijacked by headlines based on the last 12 months. But nevertheless, this outlook of a decade allowed left and right to sit around that table and think about what some of these issues are. And I would say there was a remarkable amount of agreement in areas such as revamping human capital associated with foreign policy, appropriately financing and funding foreign policy apparatus and institutions, the need to have conversations regarding foreign policy outside of the Beltway, the need to reboot a new type of multilateralism. So there really was much to be optimistic about. And at the same time, yes, there were issues where there were very vivid conversations and where we frankly were unable to find agreement. That might have been, how do you define exactly what the values of US foreign policy are? How do you deal with unsavory allies? And some very interesting conversations about the deep state. And sure enough, there were two very distinct points of view on that final point. So we have an exciting hour ahead of us. Karen, I'm thrilled that you can lead this conversation. I'm also thrilled that Bob Kagan, who was not part of this year's conversation, but was the chair of the group 5 years ago, is able to sort of make the linkage between those two conversations. So Ivo, thank you for hosting. Heather, thank you for being there. And Karen, I'll pass the baton to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Victoria, and thank you, Paul. And welcome. Thanks to the Chicago Council, the World Economic Forum, and the Global Future Council for hosting this today and for inviting me. So my name is Karen Attia, and I am the Global Opinions Editor at the Washington Post for the Washington Post Opinion section. And normally I'm based in Washington, D.C., but today I'm back in my home state of Texas, where I have been a bit of a COVID refugee, much like many of my colleagues. But normally when I'm writing, I'm focusing on issues related to social issues, race, gender, international politics, and I have a special heart and interest for the continent of Africa. And in my capacity as an editor, my responsibility is to commission a wide range of columns and op-eds from writers around the world who can give us a real sort of granular and nuanced view of the issues that are facing their country, whether it's political, whether it's social, whether it's cultural. We just have invested heavily at the Post in really trying to broaden that international audience and vice versa, hoping that our domestic audience can benefit from more global voices and to realize that there's a countries outside of the US. So with that said, I will introduce the distinguished panelists. And of course, you can look at their full bios on the Chicago Council's website. So first off, Heather Conley, who is the Senior Vice President for Europe, Eurasia, the Arctic, and the Director of the Europe Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She's also worked as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs and oversaw U.S. bilateral relations with the countries of Northern and Central Europe. So Heather, thank you so much for being here. Ivo Dalder, I'm saying that correctly, right? Yes, is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and he has served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO under President Obama and was a senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution, specializing in American foreign policy, European security, and transatlantic relations as well as national security affairs. It's a pleasure to speak with you. As a former Chicago Council intern, it's really great to be able to have this discussion today. And last, but of course not least, Bob Kagan, who is the Stephen and Barbara Friedman Senior Fellow with the Project on International Order and Strategy in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. He's a contributing columnist to the Washington Post, this small, tiny local newspaper in the DC area, and once served in the State Department as the policy planning staff as a principal speechwriter for Secretary of State George Shultz. So thank you all again for being here today. And I guess a quick note, also Heather and Ivo were both members of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council over the past year. Bob, you were the chair of a similar group of several years ago. And I think part of this conversation is sort of, hearing a little bit from you guys about those previous conversations and how your thinking has evolved or changed or even been upended by what we've been seeing this year. So I'll just jump right in. I would love to hear, maybe just to start off with those questions about those conversations with both Heather and Ivo. Can you share what some of the key messages from those conversations, and coming into the end of 2020 with everything that has happened in this year, with the global pandemic, with demonstrations across the world for various issues, still the issues of rising inequality, differences, polarization and differences of opinions on whether the US needs to be more engaged or be, to retrench in terms of its engagement with the world. I would love to hear what from those conversations have you what's shifted your thinking now since in the last year or so, last 2 years? Maybe I'll start with you, Heather.
Well, Karen, thank you so much. And Victoria and Paul, thank you as well. It was a real honor to be part of this group. And you're absolutely right, Karen. What a challenging moment. It's always very frenzied in the run up to a presidential election. You have colleagues that you've worked with or have read or known for quite some time. People are working on different campaigns. We get that passion going a little bit. It is tough. But I would say, and these again, my own personal reflections, that I think all of us in the council, we're all pretty much practitioners, had worked in the U.S. government or had strong, close interaction with it. We felt, I think, an enormous responsibility. U.S. national security is imperiled by our deep polarization. And nerves are raw and feelings are raw, and it sometimes was hard to talk about conversations, be respectful of colleagues that worked in a different administration, and maybe you disagreed viscerally with the policies that were produced by that administration. But when we sort of were able to go back and forth, what was so, I think, important is that we found that common ground. We had differences of approach and perspective, but we did find, I think, more things that we agreed about, things we found frustrating about working in government and the inability to do things we want to do and to move things. But I think at the very end, I think we felt that the Trump administration and the Trump era, if I can put it that way, has jeopardized U.S. national security, that we felt a responsibility that we needed to come together to develop a new bipartisan consensus about national security. It's just too fraught a moment for our country to be this deeply divided. I think before I pass to Ivo, I think the challenge that we face now that we know still being certified, but we know the outcome of the election, is how we create that new bipartisan foreign and security policy that speaks to two very deeply divided Americas. And I think that is really the challenge for all U.S. foreign policy and national security policymakers, whether they're from the Republican Party or the Democratic Party.
Karen, first of all, thanks so much for doing this, and great to have you back, so to say, at the council. And I want to thank Paul and Wef and Miriam and others for shepherding us for so well for the past year through the discussions that we had, and for joining the council and presenting this program. I was part of the Global Futures Council 5 years ago, that the one that Bob chaired. And at that point, our big question was, how do we sustain American global leadership in order to maintain a stable, liberal international order? And that was the focus of our effort. And we looked at the strengths and weaknesses of American power in order to do that. We didn't have that conversation in the last year. I can assure you. As Heather said, it was really about how do you rebuild some sense of commonality across the aisle in order for the United States at least to have a foreign policy, because there was some doubt whether in fact we did or do. And I think the biggest thing that I would take away from, and there are lots of different things, but was the consensus, it seems to me, across the aisle among Democrats and Republicans and people who've been a long time participants in the foreign policy process and people who were new to it, was the destruction of institutions, both at home and abroad, and the danger that presented to foreign policy, but more importantly for global order. And that not only were our domestic institutions deeply polarized, but what had happened to the Department of State through decades of underfunding, and then through a very deliberate attempt to minimize its role in foreign policy, but throughout the attack on expertise, the attack on knowing what the government could do. That was one perspective. The other perspective, the deep state that was preventing leaders from who were elected from doing what they were elected to do. But that sense at home that the institutions weren't doing what they were supposed to do, then transposed abroad, that the big challenges that we had, whether it was COVID or the economic crisis or racial and other inequalities, as well as how to deal with technology and its influences, that the institutions that existed globally just weren't able to deal with these issues and were failing in some form. And that rebuilding institutions at home and abroad really was the number one issue that we faced. The question was how to do that. And I think there were lots of great ideas that came out of it, though less perhaps a consensus. But agreeing on what the problem was, the lack of institutional capacity, was a big and important step in the discussions that we had.
I'd love to bring Bob in on this, even though you weren't necessarily a part of these exact discussions, but just to kind of maybe open up the conversation a bit more broadly. I would just wonder if, like, and we even those of us in the media, we tend to throw around a lot of these sort of terms and words about capacity and institution building and consensus. Sometimes I sit and look at what's happened in the last year, 2 years, 4 years, honestly. I mean, in your opinion, shouldn't this be perhaps an opportunity to look at, maybe there is some epic American-sized myths about foreign policy and about some of the ways that we were even conceiving of some of even these basic terms and what they mean. What does power mean? What does the effective use, what does leadership even mean in this world? So I'd love to hear your take about, maybe some of the cracks that are appearing in our rose-tinted glasses about some of these issues.
There I go. Well, thanks, Karen, and thanks to you all. It's a great pleasure to be here virtually and talking to all of my old friends. There's always the question from a historical point of view of how different the present is from the past. We tend to always, I think there's a tendency to exaggerate how new and different everything is. I think that the person of Donald Trump is a new phenomenon. I don't think we've ever had a president who had his personality defects, which I think are a big driving force for some of what goes by the name of policy. But the broad American attitudes toward the world, and I don't, unfortunately, Evo, mean the ones that are reflected in the Chicago Council poll, but are reflected through members of Congress and elected officials, which is a different outcome. I mean, Americans have always been suspicious of the world to some extent or other. Americans have always felt like it really wasn't their job to take care of the rest of the planet. We were in that role rather unusually since World War II as a result of circumstances. I personally believe it's vital for us to play that role, but it's not unusual to have Americans doubting how much they wish to spend, how many risks they want to take, et cetera, on behalf of other nations who ought to be able to take care of themselves. And so this general mood, and I think, Evo, when we met years ago to talk about how you would defend the liberal order, one of the big problems then was, what are American attitudes and where is the political direction of the country? So that's one thing. The other thing, I don't think we should have illusions about how much the world used to love us and now has become worried about us. The problem of American hypocrisy goes all the way through our history. We were the democracy that believed in global democracy while we were a slave-holding country. It's hard to have a bigger contradiction than that. I remember, when Teddy Roosevelt was urged and pressed to protest Russian pogroms against the Jews in like the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, he had more than one advisor remind him that American lynching was on the rise in that period, and what right did we have to tell the Russians how they should treat their victims when we were obviously not doing much to protect our own. And I think if you just think about even later in the 20th century, in 1968, when you'd had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and Richard Nixon in office and the Vietnam War, I don't think the world was looking to us at that time as a great beacon of hope. On the other hand, that doesn't mean, and this is the other thing that history tells us, that we're not capable of, nevertheless, despite all that, providing significant leadership in the world. And the reason is because every country, like every human being, wants to know, what can you do for me? I may like you, I may not like you, but what I really need to know is, can you protect me against this enemy here? And I still think that despite 4 years of Trump, and despite, I would say, a retrenchment under the previous administration, the one thing we see in the world today are the number of countries really hoping that America comes back, even with everything that they've seen. I mean, the Europeans, most of them, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, you can go everywhere around the world. And I don't know what polls say, but governments are saying, gee, we really hope you're back. And I think that does mean that does give us an opportunity, and we shouldn't be too preoccupied with our evident failings in thinking that that prevents us, nevertheless, from providing the kind of general role, playing the general kind of role in the world that we've played before.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great and fascinating point, that there is this sense that even though, the whole world is sort of, waiting, holding their breath about sort of how this country will pass not only, its democratic stress tests, our public health, our massive public health stress test, there is a sense that goes beyond politics of this hope and this need for a country like America, this multi-ethnic experiment in many ways to make it in many ways. And so I think that is one thing that I'm sure many of you wish that more Americans could see and could understand. I want to go back to Heather, actually, and maybe just a little bit more specific on what. And you talked a bit about the polarization and it making it difficult to even have that person-to-person conversation. I mean, the whole. We said, being hijacked by headlines, by my industry, that it really has gotten into these debates have really gotten into a state where it's foreign policy disagreements, political disagreements become so personal almost. So I just would want to know, I mean, for you, given your experience, I mean, what are you looking at as maybe, say, the top two most important foreign policy tests and challenges that you would hope that the U.S., a healthy U.S., would be able to address?
Thanks, Karen. I mean, in some ways, sort of looking at it structurally, what has happened over the last 4 years, very much in reaction to President Trump, and again, President Trump expressed views that are very much against 70 years of U.S. foreign and security policy, that, instead of allies being an American strength, they are a drain. They are ripping us off. Now, exactly to Bob's point, there's always been a hesitancy of America sort of losing its sovereignty to multilateral institutions, that it loses its freedom of maneuver, if you will, to make its own choices. But again, great powers have those great myths, and our great myth certainly came from the Second World War and our victory and our creation of institutions that were absolutely designed to ensure American prosperity and American security. They were self-interested policies, but they had an outward-facing view to them. Now we see, I think, the political forces we actually have a new centrism. I think there's more agreement on the center left and the center right in the national security community than there ever has been. But there's also agreement in the far left and the far right spectrum of our parties about turning inward, that isolationism, that, having U.S. forces abroad is a bad thing, that we shouldn't be part of this, that it entangles us. And so we have both an agreement, I think, on the international perspective of being more internationally oriented. We also have the far left and the far right also agreeing on isolationism. So new dynamics are coming. What's so extraordinary about your question, Karen, is that Americans are so tied to U.S. trade policy, foreign policy, and security policy. They just don't see how they're connected to that policy. And certainly I would argue that Washington has been part of that, sort of with the view that trust us, we've got this. and we can manage this. Well, we lost the trust. We haven't been successful in our foreign policy endeavors when the average American looks at the Middle East or South Asia, or looks at our trade policy and sees that, some benefited, but others were negatively affected. So I think what we need to do is really change the conversation. We need to help the American people understand how tied they are internationally, that jobs, that prosperity, that security are tied to our international policies, and they have a role to play. So to answer your question, what are the top issues? Well, I think trade is really one of that incredible intersection where people do want to understand how global trading patterns affect their job, their well-being, for their children to be successful in the future. I think we are entering a new framing, not just of great power competition of the U.S., but China will loom very large, and unfortunately became very much, and it will continue to be a very partisan perspective about China. Who's the toughest? Who's going to show that that they're not the ones standing? Well, let's have a conversation about what U.S. treasure and investment is going to be made in making sure that China does not pose a challenge to America's economic prosperity or its security. So we have to right ourselves right now with the American people and rebuild that trust. Right now, foreign policy has become very much part of a deeply bitter partisan debate, and that weakens U.S. national security. So that's what we have to get back into a conversation with the American people, because ultimately we need the American people's support for any policy endeavor that we wish to accomplish.
Mm-hmm. Ivo or Bob, I don't know if you want to comment on any of those threads.
Let me add sort of two things. One just to emphasize our polling, which we've been doing for almost half a century now, on finding what the American public attitudes are on these kinds of issues. In the most recent poll that came out in September, the deep divisions in this country and partisan polarized divisions between Democrats and Republicans on how to engage the world is now deeper than it has ever been. And it is very, very destructive for an ability to conduct a foreign policy that needs to have the support of the American people. Just one example, the top 5 threats seen by Republicans do not appear on the list of the top 5 threats of Democrats and vice versa. And it just tells you that the way Democrats and Republicans look at the world is fundamentally different. That makes it very hard to conduct a unified foreign policy, because those public attitudes both reflect and are reflected in the political debate that we have in Washington.
If I could just jump in, could you run through those differences? I mean, from off the top of your head.
Democrats tend to see global and societal threats as number one. So highest is COVID. And dealing with COVID. Second is climate change. Third and fourth are racial and social inequality. And fifth is foreign interference in our election. Those are the top 5 threats that Democrats have. Republicans see external security threats. Number one, the growth of China, Chinese world power, terrorism, Iran, large numbers of immigrants and refugees coming into our country. So it's the foreign nature of the threat that comes to the U.S. that tends to be on the top for Republicans. And while Democrats will recognize those, they're very low on the list, and the percentages who think they're critical are lower in the list. And again, vice versa. So it's a very different kind of way of thinking about it, which makes making foreign policy so contentious, as it was in the last 4 years, as it was in the 4 years before that, as it's bound to be in the next 4 years. And the second sort of point, building on Bob's observation, that the world is sort of hunkering for America to rejoin it, to be part of it. And like many of you, I'm sure you've gotten your emails and phone calls and texts from friends around the world saying, "Oh my God, you guys are back." Well, we may be back, but and there's a sense of normality. I mean, to have the the president-elect having phone calls, the first phone call with the Canadian prime minister, then with our European and Asian allies, is a departure from what we've seen before when the first phone calls were with General Sisi and Erdogan 4 years ago, and that the only way the Australian prime minister could get through was to ask Greg Norman, the golfer, for Donald Trump's number in order to get in. So it's a little different, this case. And there's a normality to it. If you read the press releases of the phone calls, they're a paragraph long. They deal with issues. They're kind of, the way we used to be. We haven't seen that. So in that sense, there is this sense of return. But here's the reality. One, the political support for that foreign policy is weak, given the fact that the country is so disunited on these issues. Two, the fact that you had a contested election, whether right or wrong, doesn't matter, it's there, that is delegitimizing, once again, the president of the United States. And third, the reality that the crises, health, economic, racial, democracy, climate, that Joe Biden is going to face when he enters office means his attention necessarily is going to be drawn inward to deal with those crises. And that's the challenge we face. There is an incredible demand for American leadership and engagement at a time when the ability of the United States to deliver on that is perhaps less than it has been in a long time, even with the goodwill that no doubt Joe Biden and the team that he will surround himself with will provide. That's the really, I think, the big challenge, the disappointment that America is not delivering what the world expects it to deliver.
No, these are all great, if not sobering points. One thing that has come up even with this election, not just the election, the last 4 years, is again the conversations, beliefs, feelings about what threats are and what threats aren't, and it's hard to disentangle that from the reality of how people even get their information, the silos, whether it's, people from the right can go to Facebook, only look at their information sources from people who are playing to that crowd, and same, for people on the left. And so it's we're entering a phase where we're facing the prospect of, yes, an administration changeover, but Trumpism, those beliefs aren't going away anytime soon. And so back to your point, Bob, earlier about so much of this foreign policy being so personality driven. I think that's one element of something we saw over the last several years, where it was very much about, we saw the diminishment of the State Department. We saw Trump being very interested in doing these more like one-on-one deals with these leaders, believing that, just kind of, doing things his way personally without necessarily always this whole of government approach to policy was the way to go. So I'm wondering, how that that will present challenges now that we do now have a different foreign policy playbook, in part thanks to Trump. And so, yeah, I would love to know what you think about that, and again, this polarization. Are we entering a period where hyper-partisan foreign policy might be the new normal?
Again, if you look at it from a historical perspective, there's a couple of things that I think have always been true. One is that foreign policy debates in America have also always been domestic political debates as well. And that the two are they're unbreakable in terms of the influence on each other. People who belong to a certain party tend to take their cues from the leadership of that party as to what their foreign policy attitudes are. Obviously, to some extent, the leaders of the party also have to figure out what the people want. So there's a dialogue, but we have seen on numerous occasions parties absolutely pivoting on a dime in their general worldview just for largely electoral reasons. And my favorite example of that is that the Republican Party was the internationalist party going into World War I. It was the party of Teddy Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge and John Hay, and they were the internationalist party. And the Democratic Party going into World War I was the isolationist party. I mean, Woodrow Wilson did not expect to spend any time on foreign policy. So when Woodrow Wilson then, as president, became the leader of the internationalist view, the Republicans pivoted entirely toward isolationism, and just as a means, because, and what they know, and this is relevant now too, you can always arouse suspicions among a certain portion of the American public that the internationalists are somehow selling out the country to the rest of the world, that they're not really representing the United States. The term internationalist in like 1918 and 19 became a criticism, because it was internationalism was opposed to Americanism. So that's always there. But in general, we're going to see the two parties now try to figure out where their best place to be is, and from a political point of view. So I wouldn't, again, it's a myth to think there was not polarization before. Even during the Cold War, when we thought we had a bipartisan foreign policy, let's face it, Republicans were using anti-communism as a means to try to beat the Democrats over the head for selling out to communism throughout the entire Cold War period. The Democrats had to fend that off. And in a way, the bipartisanship was built around that battle, you know? So again, I don't want to overstate how either significant or new this is. A lot will have to do now in these coming 4 years, for instance, with how the Republican Party decides it wants to position itself, which will also be a response to how the Biden administration positions itself, and of course, importantly, to events. Things are going to happen. We are going to respond to them, and then the political system will figure out how to take advantage of that, and that will, you know, guide the direction that we go in.
I know we only have a few minutes left, and this is probably not the greatest time for me to inject this question, which probably deserves another hour. But, you know, I just want to inject a little bit of like grim reality to this whole discussion. Again, joining you guys from Texas, which just crossed the 1 million COVID case mark yesterday or today. And if Texas was a country again, because we were before, but if we were a country again, we would rank 10th in the world for COVID cases. Right now, the US is going through what is arguably a mass casualty event. So back to, you know, these questions, we're wanting to appeal to Americans to care about what's happening outside of our borders. But yet, you know, we're looking at the death tolls, and we're on track for hundreds of thousands of more people to die. Our economy, beyond, you know, the stock prices, but people are losing their jobs. I mean, isn't the case for more engagement, especially hard right now? And I would think, I mean, what do you say to people who say we are literally facing a crisis that America has never seen before, will probably take Lord knows how long to recover from? Maybe this is the time to step back. I'm opening it to the floor, whoever wants to respond to that.
So just to start off, perhaps, I mean, an epidemiologist today in the New York Times, I know we're not supposed to talk about that paper, but was quoted today in the New York Times saying, you know, what's happening in our country is 2 jumbo jets are falling out of the air every single day. And if that were to happen, we would panic. And why aren't we doing that now? Which I think was an appropriate sort of way to think about it. It is an extraordinary crisis, and it is a crisis that, it seems to me, highlights 2 fundamental problems. One is we are interconnected with the rest of the world in a way that is just a reality. It isn't the case that if only we had closed our borders earlier, this wouldn't have happened. This was going to happen in one form or another, because it is a disease for which we have not yet any defense. And so that means working together with others in order to address the challenge is absolutely necessary. We're not going to be safe until everyone is safe. So that's one sort of reality. The other is government and leadership matter. And I think one of the lessons, and this is true on the left and the right, on Democrats and Republicans, is, although there's a different kind of appreciation, but a renewed appreciation that having effective governance is actually necessary to deal with these massive problems: pandemics, climate change, the economic crisis. I mean, we've spent more already, and we haven't even spent enough than in any other economic crisis because of the need. This is like World War II in many ways, in the way we are dealing with it, and only government can do that. Now, we can have a debate about whether government's done it in the right and wrong way, and et cetera. But those are sort of the two sort of different realities that I do think is resetting the way in which Americans are relating to not only their own government, but also to the world. The question is, where's the leadership going to come from to guide us into the next phase? And I mean, in part, that's what this election was about. And it's one of the reasons I think that one guy won, even though the other guy got a lot of votes.
Karen, we at CSS, or actually I'm sure other think tanks are doing this as well, doing a major center-wide study on what we believe the impacts of COVID-19 will be on perceptions and really moving towards the international system. And very much to echo Ivo's thoughts, it really comes down to sort of what is the view about the competency of government to manage the crisis, and from competency stems legitimacy and trust. And so doing comparative understandings where some countries where there was strong trust in government institutions and the competency to manage this have seemed to weather it. Where there was great distrust and there's a breakdown in the system, clearly that's the case. I think you're also seeing, to your earlier point, and maybe this is a phenomenon we really have to understand, the great decentralization that is happening in response to the pandemic, regional shutdowns versus national shutdowns, how urban areas address the crisis, how rural areas address it, how technology plays. I mean, this has been the great disruptor, if you will. And we've been doing some comparative studies. Bob has been so great in pulling us so thoroughly into history. I mean, after the Spanish flu, the pandemic, there wasn't big adjustments in the international system. Now, granted, we were still in the throes of the First World War, and maybe that was enough to the system was already being rejiggered a bit. But, will there be big structural changes based on this, or will this be more, exactly as you said, a real internal reckoning about our processes and our systems? And I would argue, I think it's going to call for even more decentralization and more, governance and competency must be closer to home to manage crises. And then there has to be competency at the national or federal level. So we're really just in real time trying to understand the impact of this domestically as well as internationally.
Baba, yeah, I think you could have the last say on that, or any thread you'd like to.
Well, it is interesting to go back to the Spanish flu example, because one of the more striking things is that if you go through Woodrow Wilson's speeches, writings, letters, etc., he barely mentions the existence of the flu throughout this entire period. And even though I think there's a reasonable chance that he caught it and almost died in Paris of it. But it was just, in answer to the question, and this may be, well, that was a different world and we're different now, or what have you, but can a country function overseas while going through a crisis like this? Wilson was overseas negotiating the Versailles Treaty throughout this entire period, with America exercising more power on the world stage than it had ever done before by a magnitude, while going through a Spanish flu, which was decimating, significant portions of the population. So again, should we be focused on this? Absolutely, it should be our top priority. Does that preclude us carrying out an effective foreign policy? In my view, the answer is no.
Makes sense. All right. I think on that note, I will open the floor up to questions from the audience. And here we can get into a little bit more sort of nitty gritty. The first one is, how does a Biden administration approach countries that have had favorable relations with the Trump administration, Saudi Arabia, Russia, North Korea, etc.? And I would add to that question, multiple administrations have had favorable relationships with Saudi Arabia, which is, part of how we find ourselves here today, with Mohammed bin Salman. But I think that would be an interesting question to whoever wants to take that one.
I think Boris Johnson in the UK is actually trying to navigate a transition as well. Poland and Hungary are also in that category. Well, I mean, again, I think this is where countries that are strong allies of the United States and have a deep commitment, personalities do shape policy, don't get me wrong, but the relationship has deep sinews that really defy any particular leader. I look at that, the US-UK relationship, but yes, there will be significant differences in how the Biden administration will address countries, particularly those that have walked away from the democracy agenda, have limited their own rule of law. I would add Turkey into that conversation, since Ivo mentioned that was one of the first calls. I think Turkey and President Erdogan will definitely have a different change. And these leaders are starting to prepare for this. We saw that in Turkey the other day with changing out a new central bank governor. His son-in-law is no longer finance minister. His son-in-law had a very close relationship with Mr. Kushner in the White House. So the balancing has already begun, but certainly allied relationships have strong. And on Russia, I would just say very, very briefly, that was a relationship that, the Russians do not believe they got value out of. They see a continuity of crisis. President Trump had a very different conversation, but that didn't affect the policy itself. So there will be continuity, but we're seeing leaders already make some very important adjustments to their policies in anticipation of a different approach.
Great. I just want to say to the audience, if you have a question, open up your browser and type in ccga.live, and you can submit your question there or vote for the ones you like, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Let's see here. Another question, which I think is a great one, is we're talking about restoring credibility and multilateralism. This question asks, after abrogating U.S. participation in the Paris Climate Agreement and the JCPOA, with other states, whether it's our allies or adversaries, work with us on multilateral agreements that just may be overturned in 4 years. Whoever wants to take that.
Well, again, I think the world is used. It's one of the wonderful things about dealing with the United States is that we are, in some respects, capable of changing our minds about things. There was all the treaties that the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, pulled out of after the Clinton administration. Nothing is more dramatic than our refusal to sign the treaty that Woodrow Wilson negotiated. Refusal to ratify. And so I think the world is sort of used to this. And I think some agreements will be easier to get back into than others. Obviously, I think that people will welcome us back into the Paris Accords if that's what happens. Iran is the JCPOA is a much more difficult question. I would not blame Iran for feeling like, which is, by the way, I think what Khamenei felt all along, which was that any deal you made with the United States was a sucker's bet. So I don't know how you would persuade the Iranians to get back into some kind of deal, but it could be that their objective situation is such that they need some kind of deal, and we can try to do it. But in general, I think, as I say, the world adjusts, and I don't think it'll make it impossible to, for instance, even negotiate a new START deal, possibly. So I wouldn't overstate the damage done, even though there has been damage.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will go to, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that?
I do, but they're not that different from Bob or Heather. So I generally agree. I mean, the reality is, countries need the United States, and if they can keep them in for 4 years, then hopefully they can change the domestic politics sufficiently to make it last. I mean, one of the agreements we have never signed is the one we spent more time thinking about as an important agreement, which is the law of the sea, which we try to enforce everywhere else, even though we're not a party to it. And we have never been able to ratify. We've signed it, but we've never ratified it. The Test Ban Treaty, another one. We haven't tested nuclear weapons in the early 1990s. We signed a treaty, but haven't ratified it. So if as long as it's in our interest, we tend to either find a way to live with it, and if it's not in our interest, then it probably wasn't that important a treaty in the first place, or a next administration will come back and adhere to it again.
Mm-hmm. So here's a question, a China question, which I think is actually quite interesting. And this asker, this question says, with public opinion becoming in the US increasingly wary of China, can the new administration look for areas of cooperation, or will it be compelled to take a hard line? And I would just add to that, I mean, I think, again, even being here in Texas, and I'm even seeing if there is one foreign policy issue that, the Republicans and conservatives and Trump voters that I know here know about and care a lot about, it is China. And we've seen even sort of culturally, even when it comes to sports and the dust up with the NBA, and businesses doing businesses with China and being subject to their laws and censorship and the issues with Hong Kong. I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. Are we looking at a future where it is going to be increasingly difficult, actually, for an administration to do anything that is seen as cooperating with China?
Maybe let me start off. It's a huge question and that is out there. Clearly, sort of the public and I think elite view of China has changed over the last 4 years, and the Trump administration has led the charge in helping to change that view from a belief, bipartisan belief, that engaging economically and politically and strategically with China would sort of change its behavior more to our liking and bring it into the family of nations, to I think now a consensus that that's not going to happen anytime soon, at least, and that China is now powerful enough to pursue its interests in a way that it judges to be good, whether we like it or not, and therefore we have to have a more competitive relationship. The fundamental question, and I think this is where the Biden administration may try to sort of depart from the previous administration, is there are places where there may be positive some alignments, where there is an agreement, whether it's on fighting a pandemic or dealing with climate change or handling non-proliferation, where it would make sense to have a strategic dialogue to try to cooperate. We, during the height of the Cold War, had a dialogue with the Soviet Union on a set of issues, including, importantly, the issue of arms control, where we judged it was just better in our interest to talk about these things and avoid a war that neither side wanted, even as we were competing across the board, ideologically, militarily, politically, and economically in the rest of the world. So it's this a more modulated posture where you will compete where you have to and try to cooperate where you can. My worry is, in fact, that China has become the political issue here at home, and that any attempt to reach out to Beijing to try to find common ground will immediately be seen as, there you go again, you're so weak and you're not tough enough, and that we get the same dynamic that Bob rightly mentioned during the Cold War, when we thought we had, quote, a bipartisan foreign policy. But boy, the debates in the 70s or in the 60s and in the 50s and in the 80s on the differences between Democrats and Republicans on those issues were pretty stark too. And my sense is that's going to happen in spades on the issue of China going forward.
Mm-hmm. Now I know we have a few more minutes left, and I think the last question I'd like to take is, so the question as is how can the Biden administration make U.S. foreign policy more inclusive and more applicable to a wider set of Americans? I think that's an interesting question, but I would also broaden that out, my co-guest wished to take it on, but even for those of us who are sitting and having these conversations and having these discussions, sitting at our institutions, at our think tanks, I mean, how do we make foreign policy conversations more inclusive? Whether that means, we're thinking through expanding and broadening who we bring in to think about what it means to engage with the world, whether it's a diversity in terms of race, gender, activists, security, policing. I'd love to hear what you guys think on what would make foreign policy more of something that people feel that they have a stake in and feel represented in. Don't all rush.
Well, the problem is not, interestingly, different segments of the American population have specific issues that they care a lot about. So for instance, Christian evangelicals care a lot about Israel and the Middle East. And so they don't need to be persuaded to care about that. They do care about it. Armenians are concerned with Armenia, et cetera. I could go down the list, obviously. The problem comes with having a general sense of the importance of overall American engagement. Now, sometimes those particular concerns aid a general understanding. I would say most people, for instance, who worry about the security of Israel have some basic understanding that if Israel's security is going to be protected, the United States has to be involved in the world, and people who are worried about, other parts of the world that they feel close to. But the hardest thing in the world to do is to persuade a large number of Americans that the general involvement of the United States in the world is directly beneficial to them. And the reason is because, yes, you could make the case on trade and a couple of other things, but fundamentally, it remains the case that the rest of the world will fall apart long before the United States feels any direct impact of that. And it was the case in the late 1930s that even as Hitler was conquering nation after nation in Europe, the vast majority of Americans could not be persuaded that that mattered to them. And I think we need to be humbled by Franklin Roosevelt's experience. He's the most gifted politician probably in our history, and he was unable to persuade Americans that Hitler conquering Europe was a problem for them. So as we try to make this case, I think we should, as I say, have reasonable expectations for how effectively we can do this.
So Karen, I'd love to, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I was just saying even the case of the genocides in Rwanda, Yemen, now, and that situation. Sometimes we don't even have to look all that far back. We have the situation in Yemen is just almost incomprehensible, and we are supplying arms and weapons to the Saudi and Gulf coalition.
Right, and where's the outcry about that, right? So, yeah.
Sorry, Heather.
No, I was just saying, but I think very much to your point, it has to matter. It has to matter to an individual. And I think we need to start thinking about a citizen-centric approach to foreign policy. Certainly we have to think about a generational approach, because we need to grow the next generation of leaders that have a strong sense of global engagement and the positive role that selective U.S. engagement and leadership can have. In some ways, a citizen-centric model, we're thinking about it now in defense terms, from cyber hygiene to disinformation, that you are responsible for your own, protection of what you're reading and hearing and understanding, but it's also making those connections of our citizens, that their jobs, their security, there is an international connection. I think one of the most positive conversations that we had during one of our, I think our last in-person council meetings before we went virtual, was really, no matter all the disagreements around the table, we came back to, the value of U.S. leadership is our belief in the dignity of the individual. And even in our moment this summer when the United States was at its worst as far as what we were projecting in our own society, even that dark moment was, you look at what happened in Europe, the awakening of their own racial injustice. Even in our very negative moment, we can still be an example. So I think it's just making this more personal, more citizen focused. It's not something far away that Washington dreams up and perhaps bungles. It is about the individual, how we connect to those individuals. We're now more globally connected via social media than we ever have before, but yet it's still creating that apathy that Bob had mentioned. How do you break down those barriers? I think you make it very personal, and you motivate individuals, and then you channel them and how they can support U.S. foreign and security policy.
Okay. Well, I think with that, I think that is all the time that we have for today. Bob, Heather, Ivo, thank you so much for doing this today. I've actually learned a lot, and I'm coming away thinking about a lot of things, and I'm sure that the audience is too. And for all of those who tuned in, thank you so much for connecting. And please, share this, retweet it, post it to your WhatsApp groups. I think it's a really important jumping off point to think about as we weather the next several months, and as we weather a lot of these challenges. So again, thank you all so much.